They called his name not to honor him, but to make him disappear. In a brightly lit public hall, with cameras rolling and hundreds of eyes fixed forward, a single father was asked to step to the microphone and take responsibility for a failure that wasn't his. He stood there quietly, wearing a jacket he'd owned for years, hands clenched, knowing that whatever he said next could cost him his job, his reputation, and the fragile stability his child depended on. No one in the room knew how many nights he worked double shifts or how often he skipped meals so his son wouldn't have to. To them, he was just a name on a document, a convenient answer to an inconvenient problem. The officials spoke confidently, rehearsed, certain that silence would do what fear always does. They believed he would lower his head, sign what was put in front of him, and walk away quietly. After all, men like him were expected to endure, not to speak. But inside his pocket was an old phone, and inside that phone was a photo that changed everything. A small boy, asleep, trusting completely in the man everyone else was ready to sacrifice. The father understood something in that moment that the room did not. If he stayed silent today, his child would one day learn that truth was something you traded for safety. The microphone hummed softly as the room waited for his answer. He did not raise his voice, and he did not attack anyone. He simply chose not to lie. And that single decision would unravel far more than anyone in that room was prepared for, because this story is not about rebellion or heroism or winning. It is about what happens when a father refuses to teach his child that silence is survival. Daniel Reyes never described himself as strong. He had learned early that strength was a word people used when they wanted you to endure without complaint. What he believed in instead was consistency, the quiet kind that showed up every morning whether anyone noticed or not. At 38, Daniel's life was built from routines stacked carefully on top of one another. Wake before dawn, coffee measured, not poured, a quick check of the weather, work boots by the door, always facing the same direction. These details mattered because they were predictable, and predictability was the closest thing to safety he could give his son. Noah was 8 years old, small for his age, with a medical chart thicker than most adults. His immune system was fragile, prone to infections that lingered longer than they should. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but serious enough to turn ordinary colds into hospital visits. Daniel knew every symptom by heart, every warning sign that meant it was time to leave work early or spend another night in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed. Raising Noah alone was not something Daniel had planned for, but planning had stopped being useful the day his wife died. There had been no long illness, no slow decline that allowed the mind to prepare. One moment she was there, joking about burnt toast in the morning. The next, a doctor was explaining things Daniel could not process fast enough to understand. Grief did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, reshaping everything underneath it. After the funeral, Daniel returned to work within 2 weeks. Not because he was ready, but because Noah needed stability, and stability required a paycheck. He took every shift offered, every night rotation no one else wanted. The infrastructure maintenance department became a second home, filled with fluorescent lights and humming machines that demanded attention, but never asked questions. His job was simple on paper: inspect, maintain, and certify electrical systems in public facilities, schools, libraries, transit stations, municipal buildings. Most people never thought about these systems unless something went wrong. Daniel thought about them constantly. He understood how small shortcuts could ripple outward, how one ignored fault could become another family's tragedy. At work, Daniel spoke little. He documented everything. Supervisors liked him because he was efficient, because he didn't socialize, because he never complained about overtime. Colleagues trusted him because when he said something was wrong, it usually was. For years, that balance held. At home, Daniel was different. He cooked meals carefully, cutting vegetables into shapes Noah liked. He learned which TV shows calmed him when breathing became difficult, which songs helped him sleep. On nights when Noah's cough worsened, Daniel would sit beside the bed, hand resting lightly on his son's chest, counting breaths until morning came. Money was always tight. Hospital bills did not respect budgets, and insurance only went so far. Daniel stopped buying anything that wasn't necessary. No new clothes, no vacations, no emergencies he hadn't already imagined. When Noah asked why they never traveled like other kids, Daniel smiled and said, "We'll go someday." Someday became a placeholder for hope. Daniel never talked about work at home. He believed children should not inherit adult fears. But Noah was observant. He noticed when Daniel came home later than usual, when his shoulders were tighter, when the silence in the apartment grew heavier. "Did something break?" Noah asked one night as Daniel reheated leftovers. "No," Daniel replied. "Everything's fine." It wasn't a lie yet, just an incomplete truth. The project that changed everything began as just another assignment. A routine inspection beneath a newly renovated civic complex rushed to completion under emergency funding. The city praised it as a symbol of progress, efficiency, renewal. Daniel approached it the way he approached everything else, with patience, caution, and attention to detail. What he found beneath the surface didn't match the speeches above it. At first, it was small things, materials that didn't meet specifications, wiring paths altered to save time, load calculations adjusted just enough to pass a quick review. Daniel assumed it was an oversight. He took photographs, logged notes, filed a preliminary report. He expected corrections. Instead, he received silence. That silence was unfamiliar, unsettling. And as Daniel would soon learn, it was not empty. It was intentional. Still, he went home that night and made dinner. He helped Noah with homework. He checked his son's temperature before bed. Life, as always, demanded forward motion. Daniel did not yet know that the routines he relied on, the very structure holding his life together, were already beginning to crack. And when they did, they would not break quietly. The silence following Daniel's report lasted longer than it should have. In his experience, even bad news received acknowledgement. A note, a follow-up, a request for clarification. What he received instead was nothing. No rejection, no approval, no questions, just absence. And absence, Daniel knew, was rarely accidental. He returned to the site 2 nights later, this time not as an inspector but as a man trying to reassure himself that he had been wrong. He told himself he had overanalyzed, that pressure and exhaustion had sharpened his caution into paranoia. But the deeper he went, the clearer the truth became. The shortcuts were real, the risks were measurable, and the consequences, if ignored long enough, would not be abstract. One overloaded junction could knock out power to half the building. One improperly grounded line could turn a routine maintenance task into a fatal accident. Daniel had seen it before in older infrastructure, how negligence hid behind probability until probability ran out. He documented everything again, more thoroughly this time. Photographs with timestamps, cross-reference standards, independent calculations. He didn't embellish, he didn't editorialize, he simply recorded what was there. The next morning, his supervisor called him into the office. The man closed the door gently, as if afraid of being overheard. He spoke quietly, leaning back in his chair, fingers interlaced. He said Daniel's name more than necessary, as though familiarity could soften what came next. "You've done your due diligence, the supervisor said, "but this project has already cleared final review." Daniel nodded. "Then my report should be part of that record." The supervisor hesitated. "There's no need to escalate this further." "What happens if something fails?" Daniel asked. The supervisor sighed. "You're thinking too narrowly. This is bigger than one checklist." That sentence stayed with Daniel long after he left the office. Bigger than one checklist, bigger than safety, bigger than the people who would walk through that building every day, assuming someone had done their job. Daniel returned to his desk and logged the report into the compliance system himself, bypassing informal channels. It wasn't defiance, it was procedure. The system existed for moments exactly like this, when judgment conflicted with convenience. Within 48 hours, the consequences began. His night rotation was canceled, temporarily. His badge access to certain facilities was restricted due to administrative updates. A training session he'd been scheduled to attend was suddenly full. None of it was explained directly. None of it needed to be. At home, Daniel noticed the change in his own body before he noticed it anywhere else. Sleep became lighter. His jaw stayed clenched longer. He caught himself staring at walls, replaying conversations, wondering when exactly he had crossed an invisible line. Noah noticed too. "You're quieter," Noah said one evening as they sat on the couch, homework spread between them. "I'm just thinking," Daniel replied. "About work?" Daniel paused. He had promised himself he wouldn't bring work home, but Noah wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking out of concern. "Yeah," Daniel admitted, "a little." Noah considered this, then nodded. "When I think too much, my chest hurts." Daniel reached out instinctively, resting his hand over his son's sternum. "Does it hurt now?" "No," Noah said. "It just feels tight sometimes." Daniel swallowed. He knew that feeling too well. A week later, the reassignment became official. Daniel was removed from inspections and placed on temporary administrative duties, inventory reviews, filing, tasks that required his presence but not his judgment. It was framed as neutral, supportive even, a chance to reset. Daniel understood the message clearly. Stay visible, stay quiet. He considered doing exactly that. The idea tempted him more than he wanted to admit. Administrative duties came with regular hours, predictable pay, less scrutiny, less conflict. Noah's next medical appointment was coming up, and the deductible loomed large. Stability wasn't abstract. It had a dollar amount attached to it. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the report spread out in front of him. He reread his own words, stripped of emotion, factual and restrained. They didn't sound dangerous, they sounded necessary. His phone buzzed with an email notification. A citywide memo announced the project's official completion. Photos of smiling officials, words like innovation and efficiency. No mention of inspections, no mention of safety concerns. Daniel felt something settle in his chest, not anger, but clarity. He knew then that silence would not protect him. It would only delay the cost and transfer it to someone else. A technician, a janitor, a passerby, someone who trusted that the systems beneath their feet were solid. The following morning, Daniel requested a formal review under the city's public accountability process. It was a slow mechanism, rarely used, designed to appear transparent while discouraging participation. Submitting a request meant attaching your name permanently to a problem no one wanted acknowledged. He submitted it anyway. 3 days later, the notice arrived, summoning him to a public hearing. Daniel read the letter standing in the hallway outside Noah's bedroom. He could hear his son humming softly to himself, the way he did when he felt safe. Daniel leaned his head briefly against the wall, steadying himself. This was the moment the situation became irreversible. He didn't know how the hearing would unfold. He didn't know who would stand with him or who would turn away. He only knew that whatever happened next would no longer be contained within office walls or private conversations. That night, as Daniel tucked Noah into bed, his son looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to be home tomorrow?" Daniel smiled. "Yes." "Promise?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." It was the only promise he could still keep without lying. And as he turned off the light, Daniel understood that the choice to speak had already been made. Not in that hearing room, not in the reports, but in every quiet decision he had made to be the kind of father his son could trust. The morning of the hearing arrived without ceremony, no sirens, no warnings, just a gray sky and the low hum of traffic as Daniel walked toward the civic building with measured steps. He arrived early, not out of eagerness, but habit. Years of night shifts had trained him to show up before problems could find him. Inside, the hearing room felt colder than the rest of the building. Not physically, though the air conditioning was aggressive, but emotionally. The room was designed to look open and neutral, yet everything about it communicated hierarchy. The elevated panel, the microphones fixed in place, the rows of chairs arranged to face authority, not conversation. Daniel took a seat near the back. He noticed the cameras first, sleek, silent, already angled toward the front. Journalists murmured to one another, flipping through notes they hadn't written themselves. Consultants checked their phones. Everyone looked busy, informed, prepared. Daniel felt none of those things. When the hearing was called to order, a city official outlined the purpose with practiced ease. This was about transparency, about accountability, about ensuring public resources were used responsibly. The language was smooth, reassuring, designed to calm rather than clarify. Then the project was summarized. Daniel listened carefully. Dates were compressed, costs were reframed, delays were emphasized without context. The words moved quickly, leaving little space for questions. It was a story told with confidence, and confidence, Daniel knew, was often mistaken for truth. When his name was introduced, it came with qualifiers: an employee involved in the inspection process, concerns about procedural alignment, opportunities for improvement. Each phrase nudged the narrative closer to him without stating it outright. Daniel walked to the microphone. The sound of his shoes against the polished floor seemed louder than it should have been. He adjusted the microphone slightly, then waited. The first questions were gentle. Where had he worked? How long had he been with the department? What was his role in the project? Daniel answered simply. Then the questions shifted. Why had he submitted multiple reports? Why had he bypassed his supervisor? Why had he delayed the project timeline by insisting on additional reviews? The word delayed landed heavily. Daniel clarified that his reports followed protocol, that safety reviews were not delays but requirements, that any timeline affected was the result of non-compliance, not his insistence on documentation. The panel members nodded politely. One of them tapped a pen against a folder. Another leaned back, arms crossed. A council representative asked whether Daniel felt qualified to override approvals already granted. Daniel felt the trap close. I didn't override anything, he replied. I reported what I found. And do you believe, the representative continued, that your interpretation was the only reasonable one? Daniel paused. He understood the subtext. Reasonableness was subjective. Safety, apparently, was negotiable. I believe the data was clear, he said. And when data is clear, interpretation matters less than response. The room grew quieter. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw a journalist look up from their notes. The next speaker, a project consultant, took the microphone and spoke smoothly about industry norms, about acceptable margins, about how innovation sometimes required flexibility. He never mentioned Daniel by name, but every sentence pointed in his direction: flexibility, adaptation, team alignment, words that sounded positive until you understood what they were used to excuse. When Daniel was asked if he had considered the broader impact of his actions, something inside him shifted. The question implied selfishness, tunnel vision, a failure to see the bigger picture. Daniel thought of Noah again, of the inhaler in his backpack, of the nights spent counting breaths, of how one unseen failure could cascade into disaster. I did consider the broader impact, Daniel said quietly. That's why I reported it. The panel recessed shortly after. During the break, Daniel was guided into a smaller room by an aide who spoke with rehearsed politeness. Inside, a woman waited, well-dressed, calm, carrying a slim folder. She introduced herself as representing the contractor. She spoke as if they were equals, as if the imbalance in power did not exist. She explained that misunderstandings were common, that emotions ran high, that public discourse could be unpredictable. She emphasized the importance of resolution. Then she slid the folder across the table. Inside was a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone. It acknowledged Daniel's good intentions while reframing his reports as based on incomplete information. It offered clarity, closure, and stability. Daniel didn't ask how she knew about Noah. He already understood that nothing in this process was accidental. What happens if I don't sign? He asked. The woman folded her hands. The hearing will continue. Daniel nodded. When the hearing resumed, the tone had changed. The official spoke more directly now, about responsibility, about consequences, about the need to identify where processes broke down. Daniel's name appeared more frequently. He was no longer a participant. He was a variable to be managed. By the end of the session, the conclusion was implicit, if not explicit. Further review was needed. Internal processes would be examined. Daniel's conduct would be evaluated. The cameras shut off. Conversations resumed. People stood, stretched, checked messages. The room emptied quickly. Daniel remained seated for a moment, letting the noise pass around him. He understood now what had happened. The system had chosen him, not because he was wrong, but because he was convenient. He was visible enough to blame, isolated enough to absorb it, and principled enough to be portrayed as inflexible. As he left the building, Daniel felt the weight of eyes on his back. Some curious, some sympathetic, most indifferent. Outside, the city moved on. Daniel checked his phone. A message from Noah's school reminded parents of an upcoming health form deadline. Another message from the department informed him he was placed on administrative leave pending review. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, reading the words again and again. Administrative leave. It sounded temporary, neutral, reasonable. Daniel knew better. As he walked home, he didn't feel anger. He felt something heavier, a quiet understanding that from this moment forward, the story would no longer be told by facts alone, and that reclaiming the truth would require more than documentation. It would require endurance. Administrative leave began the following morning quietly and without drama. Daniel received the notice by email at 6:12 a.m., the same time he usually checked his work schedule before waking Noah. The message thanked him for his cooperation, assured him the review was procedural, and instructed him not to access internal systems until further notice. It ended with a sentence that sounded almost kind. "We appreciate your patience during this process." Patience, Daniel thought, was another word people used when they expected compliance. He closed the laptop and began breakfast as usual. Eggs scrambled lightly, toast cut diagonally because Noah insisted it tasted better that way. When Noah came into the kitchen, backpack already on his shoulders, he noticed immediately. "You're still home," Noah said. "Day off," Daniel replied. Noah smiled, then hesitated. "Are you sick?" "No," Daniel said gently. "I just have some things to figure out." Noah accepted this because children trust explanations that come without fear. He ate his breakfast and talked about a science quiz. Daniel nodded at the right moments, answering when needed, keeping his voice steady. After Noah left for school, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had read the hearing notice days earlier. Bills lay stacked neatly to one side. A calendar on the wall marked Noah's next appointment in red ink. At 10:03 a.m., Daniel's phone rang. The caller introduced himself as a representative from the city's legal department. The tone was professional, neutral, almost friendly. He explained that the review process could take time, but that the city was interested in an efficient resolution. Daniel listened without interrupting. The man suggested a meeting later that afternoon, off-site. "Just to talk," he said. "No formalities." Daniel agreed. The cafe they chose was quiet, tucked between office buildings. The representative arrived early, already seated, coffee untouched. He gestured for Daniel to sit. The conversation began broadly. Appreciation for years of service, recognition of Daniel's work ethic, and acknowledgement that things had escalated quickly. Then came the pivot. The representative explained that the city had no interest in prolonged conflict, that public trust mattered, that uncertainty benefited no one. He spoke of reputational damage, of how narratives took on lives of their own once released into the public sphere. Daniel heard the words beneath the words. The city needed the issue contained. A document appeared on the table, less formal than the one offered during the hearing recess, but no less deliberate. It outlined a voluntary clarification statement. Daniel would acknowledge that his concerns had been addressed internally, that no immediate safety risk existed, and that he regretted any public misunderstanding. In return, the city would reinstate him quietly after the review period. No disciplinary record, no termination. His position, his benefits, his health coverage, all preserved. Stability. The representative leaned forward slightly. "You have a child," he said, not unkindly. "Continuity matters." Daniel stared at the document without touching it. "What happens to the violations?" he asked. The representative smiled faintly. "They'll be monitored." It was the same answer as before, wrapped in a different voice. Daniel imagined signing. Imagined the relief of knowing Noah's prescriptions would be covered. Imagined returning to work, keeping his head down, repairing systems without questioning who approved them. He also imagined explaining it someday, explaining to his son why safety had a price, why silence was sometimes the smarter choice, why truth was negotiable when survival was at stake. The representative watched him carefully. "No one is asking you to lie," he said, "just to be flexible." Daniel looked up then. "That is a lie," he said quietly. "Just one that makes people comfortable." The representative sighed, the patience finally slipping. "You're putting yourself in a difficult position." Daniel nodded. "I know." The meeting ended politely. There were no raised voices, no threats, just an understanding that the window for cooperation was closing. By evening, Daniel's phone was filled with missed calls, colleagues checking in vaguely, a supervisor asking him to stay available, an automated message from HR reminding him of confidentiality obligations. At home, Noah was unusually tired. His cough returned sharp and dry. Daniel gave him medication and sat beside his bed longer than usual, listening. "Dad?" Noah said softly. "Did I do something wrong?" Daniel's chest tightened. "No. Why would you think that?" "You look sad," Noah replied. "That usually means I messed up." Daniel shook his head, fighting the ache in his throat. "You didn't mess up. Not ever." Noah studied him seriously. "Then why don't you just fix it?" Daniel almost laughed. Children believed everything was fixable because they hadn't yet learned how often adults chose not to. "I'm trying," Daniel said. That night, an email arrived from the contractor's legal counsel. Short, courteous, unmistakable. They were aware Daniel had declined the city's offer. They expressed concern about escalating tensions. They reminded him of his obligations under employment agreements. Between the lines was a warning. Daniel didn't reply. Instead, he opened his laptop and began organizing his files. Every report, every photo, every timestamp. He created backups and sent copies to an encrypted drive. He wasn't planning a fight. He was preparing for one. Outside, the city lights flickered on as evening settled in. Somewhere beneath them, systems hummed, carrying power through cables no one thought about unless they failed. Daniel stood at the window for a long time, watching the glow. He understood now that the price of stability was silence, and that silence once bought could never be refunded. The question was no longer whether he could afford to speak. It was whether he could afford not to. Retaliation did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, spaced just far enough apart to feel coincidental if you wanted to believe that the world was fair. Daniel stopped believing that within the first week. The first sign was financial. His administrative leave was reclassified as pending disciplinary review, which delayed his pay indefinitely. The wording was technical, bloodless. It did not say we are punishing you. It said process requires time. Time, Daniel learned quickly, was an expensive thing to be without. Bills began to stack differently, not in neat piles, but in urgency. The pharmacy called to confirm insurance coverage. The landlord sent a reminder about rent. Daniel recalculated his budget every night, moving numbers around like pieces on a board, trying to create space where none existed. The second sign was social. Colleagues who once nodded in passing now looked away. Messages went unanswered. Invitations to informal group chats disappeared. No one was cruel. No one needed to be. Distance did the work for them. Daniel understood. Fear was contagious, and proximity to him now carried risk. People had mortgages, children, aging parents. Silence was safer than solidarity. The third sign was public. A local news article framed the project controversy as a dispute between experts and a single dissenting employee. The article quoted unnamed sources suggesting Daniel had struggled with authority in the past. Another piece mentioned his personal circumstances, hinting that stress might have affected his judgment. Daniel did not comment. At home, the pressure seeped into everything. Noah's cough worsened. The doctor explained gently that stress weakened his immune response. Daniel nodded, thanked him, and scheduled another follow-up he wasn't sure how he would pay for. One night, Noah woke up gasping, his breath shallow and rapid. Daniel moved on instinct, grabbing the inhaler, counting seconds, whispering calm into the darkness. By the time the episode passed, Daniel's hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," Noah said weakly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. "You never need to apologize for being sick," he said firmly. Noah looked at him for a long moment. Is this because of your job? Daniel hesitated. Children knew more than adults like to admit. They read tone, posture, silence. They filled gaps with intuition. It's complicated, Daniel said finally. Noah nodded slowly. When things are complicated, grown-ups stop sleeping. Daniel almost smiled. The next day, Daniel received a formal notice. The contractor's legal team was requesting access to his personal communications related to the project. Emails, messages, notes. The request was framed as standard discovery preparation, but Daniel knew what it was. Pressure. He forwarded everything to a pro bono legal clinic he had contacted days earlier. They responded cautiously. Yes, he had rights. Yes, the request could be challenged. No, it would not be quick. Each step forward came with paperwork. Each delay drained resources. Daniel's savings disappeared faster than he expected. He sold his car and began using public transit. He canceled every subscription. He ate less so Noah wouldn't notice how small portions had become. Still, he did not withdraw his statements. One afternoon, as Daniel waited outside Noah's school, a parent approached him hesitantly. I saw your name in the paper, the woman said. Is everything okay? Daniel considered lying. The impulse was strong. Lying would end the conversation. It would protect Noah from being seen as the kid with the troublemaker father. It's not, Daniel said. But I'm handling it. The woman nodded, unsure what to say next. For what it's worth, she added quietly, my brother works in construction. He says corners get cut all the time. Daniel thanked her. It wasn't support, but it wasn't silence either. At night, when Noah slept, Daniel sat alone with his thoughts. Doubt crept in during those hours. Not about the facts, those were solid, but about the cost. Was truth worth this much instability? Was integrity something a child could afford? He imagined signing the statement again. Imagined relief flooding in. Imagined walking Noah to school without the knot in his stomach. Then he imagined explaining why he had done it. One evening, Noah surprised him. They were sitting at the kitchen table, drawing. Noah suddenly pushed his paper aside and asked, if you know something bad is going to happen and you don't say anything, is that lying? Daniel looked at his son carefully. Why do you ask? No reason, Noah said. Just wondering. Daniel thought for a long moment. Sometimes people say it's not lying if you're trying to protect someone, he said slowly. But sometimes not saying something lets the bad thing happen anyway. Noah frowned. Then that's worse. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Why do you think that? Because then you could have stopped it, Noah replied simply. The simplicity of it stunned Daniel. Children did not complicate morality the way adults did. They did not calculate risk the same way. They understood right and wrong in direct lines. That night, Daniel slept for the first time in weeks. The next morning, he received an email from a journalist asking for comment. Daniel declined politely. He had learned that speaking without preparation could do more harm than good. But something had shifted. Small cracks appeared in the official narrative. An engineer from another department requested anonymity and confirmed similar concerns. A former inspector reached out privately, sharing old reports that matched Daniel's findings. The isolation was no longer total. Still, the pressure intensified. Legal notices became more frequent. The city extended its review timeline. The contractor's representatives stopped being polite. Daniel was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Yet every time he considered retreat, he remembered Noah's voice in the dark, asking whether staying silent was worse. And he understood that the weight he carried was not just his own. It was the weight of what his child would learn from watching him stand or fall. The breaking point did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a raised voice. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a letter Daniel almost didn't open. The envelope was thicker than the others, stamped with legal markings that had become painfully familiar. Inside was a formal notice. The city had completed its preliminary review. The findings were inconclusive. Further investigation was required. Until then, Daniel's employment status would remain suspended, without pay. At the bottom of the letter, written in language stripped of empathy, was a sentence that felt heavier than the rest. Failure to comply with ongoing confidentiality requirements may result in further action. Daniel sat at the kitchen table long after reading it, his hands resting flat on the paper as if pressing it down could stop its meaning from expanding. Outside, traffic moved as it always did. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor laughed. Life continued with cruel indifference. That evening, Noah came home pale and quiet. His teacher had called earlier to say he'd been unusually tired, struggling to focus. By dinner time, his fever had returned. Daniel spent the night on the couch beside him, counting breaths again, listening to the familiar rattle in his son's chest. Around 3 a.m, Noah stirred and whispered, "Dad?" "I'm here," Daniel said immediately. "Are you mad at me?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Why would I be?" "Because things keep getting worse," Noah said softly, "and you look tired all the time." Daniel closed his eyes. "None of this is your fault," he said. "Nothing." Noah nodded, then hesitated. "If you say sorry, will it stop?" The simplicity of the question cut deeper than any threat the city had made. Daniel didn't answer right away. In the dim light of the living room, he imagined calling the legal representative again. Imagined saying the words he had refused to say before. Imagined signing the document, watching the tension dissolve. Imagined Noah's medication covered, the rent paid, the phone calls ending. Imagined peace. The next morning, Daniel took Noah to the doctor. The visit ended with new prescriptions and another warning about stress. As they left, Daniel noticed the total on the receipt and felt his stomach tighten. On the bus ride home, Noah leaned against him, exhausted. Daniel watched the city pass by, the buildings he had helped maintain, the infrastructure he had tried to protect. He wondered when responsibility had become something you were punished for. That afternoon, Daniel received a call from the city's legal department again. This time, the tone was different, less conciliatory, more final. The representative reminded him of the previous offer, explained that patience was wearing thin, suggested that prolonging the situation would only make things harder for everyone involved, especially your son, the man added, as if stating a fact rather than delivering a threat. Daniel said nothing. After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in the apartment, the silence pressing in from all sides. For the first time since this began, he allowed himself to consider surrender seriously. Not because he doubted the truth, but because the truth was expensive. He opened his laptop and pulled up the document he had refused to sign. He read it slowly, line by line. The words were carefully chosen, designed to erase without accusing, to neutralize without acknowledging harm. He hovered his cursor over the signature line. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about ethics or systems or public safety. He was thinking about Noah sleeping in the next room, about the steady rhythm of his breathing, about the promise he had made to be home, to protect him, to keep him safe. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This doesn't have to end badly." Daniel stared at the screen. Another message followed. "Think about what you're risking." He closed the laptop. That evening, Noah insisted on sitting at the kitchen table with him. They ate in silence for a while, then Noah spoke. "If you say something that isn't true," Noah asked, "does it stop being you?" Daniel felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "You always tell me not to lie," Noah continued. "You say lying makes things confusing. But if you lie to fix stuff, are you still you?" Daniel looked at his son, really looked at him, at the seriousness in his eyes, at the trust. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. Noah nodded thoughtfully. "I think if you lie too much, you forget why you didn't want to." Daniel reached across the table and took his son's hand. His voice was steady when he spoke. "You're right," he said. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat by the window until morning, watching the city lights fade into gray. He felt exhausted, frightened, and uncertain. But beneath all of it, something solid remained. He could lose his job, his savings, his reputation, but if he lost his son's trust, there would be nothing left to stand on. When morning came, Daniel opened his laptop again, not to sign the document, but to prepare. He organized his evidence more carefully than ever before. He contacted the legal clinic. He reached out to the journalist again, this time asking what protections existed for whistleblowers. He knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but the moment of surrender had passed. And once passed, it did not return. Change rarely announces itself. When it finally came for Daniel, it arrived not as a victory, but as a quiet shift in the air, subtle enough that he almost missed it. The first sign was an email from a former colleague named Marcus, an engineer Daniel hadn't spoken to in years. The message was short, cautious, and clearly written after much hesitation. I saw the coverage. What you reported matches what I saw last year. On a different project, I didn't say anything then. I should have. If you need confirmation, I'll talk off record. Daniel read the message twice, then a third time. He didn't reply immediately. Experience had taught him that courage often flickered before it burned steadily. Instead, he saved the email and continued organizing his files. He had learned to move carefully even with hope. The second sign came 2 days later, from the journalist he had initially declined to speak with. She wrote again, this time with a different tone, less speculative, more precise. She asked specific questions about timelines, standards, and documentation. She didn't ask him how he felt. She asked him what he could prove. Daniel responded. He sent selected records, redacted where necessary, accompanied by explanations stripped of emotion, facts only. He understood that stories built on outrage faded quickly. Stories built on evidence endured. By the end of the week, the journalist confirmed what Daniel had suspected. She wasn't alone. Other reporters were circling the issue, not because Daniel was compelling, but because patterns were emerging. The city's silence, once protective, began to look suspicious. Meanwhile, Noah's condition stabilized slightly. The fever broke. The cough softened. Daniel slept in fragments but woke each time with renewed focus. He felt a strange combination of fear and momentum, like standing at the edge of a moving platform. Then came the call Daniel had not expected. A woman introduced herself as a compliance officer from another municipal department. She spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. She explained that she had reviewed internal records after the hearing and noticed discrepancies, reports logged but never addressed, reviews marked complete without signatures. She paused before continuing. Your name came up more than once, she said. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I can't make statements publicly, the woman continued, but I can confirm that your concerns were not isolated. When the call ended, Daniel sat very still. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something closer to grief, for all the people who had stayed silent before him, for all the damage that might have been prevented. The shift became visible the following week. An internal memo leaked to the press acknowledged procedural oversights in multiple infrastructure projects. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. Daniel had not been alone, and he had not been wrong. The city announced a secondary review, this time led by an external committee. Daniel was no longer framed as the problem. He was framed as the catalyst. The retaliation didn't stop, but it changed shape. The legal notices slowed. The tone softened. The city's representatives stopped calling. At the same time, new messages arrived. Anonymous tips, archived photos, old inspection notes. People who had once convinced themselves that silence was survival now reached out quietly, hoping it wasn't too late. Daniel worked late into the nights, organizing, cross-referencing, verifying. He did not trust momentum. He trusted preparation. One evening, as he worked at the kitchen table, Noah approached him holding a crumpled piece of paper. I made this for you, Noah said. It was a drawing, stick figures holding hands beneath a building with bright windows. One figure was taller, standing slightly in front. That's you, Noah said, pointing. You're stopping it from falling. Daniel felt his throat tighten. It's very good, he said carefully. Noah shrugged. I know. At school, whispers followed Noah now, but they weren't cruel, curious mostly. One child asked if Daniel was famous, another asked if he was in trouble. Noah answered, honestly. My dad tells the truth, he said. That sentence spread faster than any article. The journalist's story published on a Sunday morning. It was long, detailed, restrained. It didn't glorify Daniel. It contextualized him. It laid out the evidence and let readers draw conclusions. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some praised Daniel's integrity. Others accused him of grandstanding. But the conversation had changed. The city was no longer in control of the narrative. Officials released statements emphasizing cooperation. Contractors announced internal audits. Lawyers spoke of transparency for the first time since the hearing. Daniel felt the pressure ease, not because the risk had disappeared, but because it was no longer his alone to bear. Still, the uncertainty remained. No charges were filed, no reinstatement was offered. The future was unresolved. One night, as Daniel tucked Noah into bed, his son asked, "Did you win?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. "I don't know yet," he said, "but people are listening now." Noah nodded, satisfied. "That's good." Daniel turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a long moment. He understood that this was not the end. Systems did not dismantle themselves easily. Accountability moved slowly, if at all. But the turning point had passed. The silence was broken. And once broken, it could not be repaired the same way again. The confirmation, when it came, was quieter than Daniel had imagined. There were no press conferences, no dramatic apologies, no clear declaration that he had been right all along. Instead, there was a carefully worded report released on a Wednesday afternoon. Buried beneath other city announcements and policy updates, the External Review Committee acknowledged systemic procedural failures across multiple infrastructure projects. It cited inadequate oversight, pressure to meet accelerated timelines, and a culture that discouraged escalation. Daniel's reports were referenced indirectly, described as early indicators that were not sufficiently acted upon. No names were mentioned. To the public, it sounded like accountability. To Daniel, it sounded like avoidance wearing a formal suit. The contractor announced corrective measures, new compliance officers, updated safety protocols, a pledge to do better. The city echoed the language, emphasizing reform rather than responsibility. No one was fired publicly. No one admitted wrongdoing. Daniel was contacted by HR 2 days later. The meeting was brief and clinical. He was informed that his suspension would be lifted. He could return to work under revised supervision. His record would show no disciplinary action. The department thanked him for his service. There was no apology. Daniel asked one question: "Will the safety violations be fixed?" The HR representative nodded. "They are being addressed." It was the same answer he had heard before, but this time it carried weight. The systems were under scrutiny now. Inspections were being repeated. Eyes were watching. Daniel accepted the reinstatement, not because it felt just, but because Noah needed health insurance. Returning to work felt strange. Familiar hallways, familiar machines, familiar hums. Some colleagues greeted him warmly. Others avoided eye contact. A few offered quiet nods of respect. No one spoke openly about what had happened. Daniel didn't expect them to. At home, life began to stabilize slowly. Bills were paid, prescriptions filled without hesitation. Noah's health improved as the stress receded, his energy returning in small, hopeful bursts. But the cost lingered. Daniel noticed it in himself first. He slept lightly, waking at small noises. He felt wary in meetings, listening not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Trust, once cracked, did not repair easily. One afternoon, as Daniel walked Noah home from school, his son asked, "Why didn't they say sorry?" Daniel stopped walking. "They probably don't think they did anything wrong," he said carefully. Noah frowned. "But they did." "Yes," Daniel replied, "they did." "Then why is everything just normal again?" Daniel considered this. Because sometimes systems care more about continuing than correcting. Noah kicked a pebble along the sidewalk. "That's dumb." Daniel smiled faintly. "It can be." The journalist published a follow-up piece weeks later. It summarized the findings, highlighted reforms, and noted that the whistleblower had been reinstated. Daniel's name appeared only once, halfway through the article. He didn't mind. He hadn't done this to be known. He had done it so something wouldn't fail quietly one night while someone else paid the price. Still, there was no sense of victory. Daniel hadn't changed the system. He had interrupted it, forced it to look at itself briefly before moving on, and that interruption had come at a cost that no report could quantify. One evening, as Daniel reviewed paperwork at home, Noah sat beside him, drawing again. After a while, Noah looked up and asked, "If it happens again, would you do the same thing?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. "But I wish it didn't have to be that hard." Noah nodded, satisfied. "Hard things are usually the important ones." Daniel laughed softly. "You're wiser than you should be." The city moved on. New projects began. New announcements filled the news cycle. The story faded from public attention, replaced by fresher outrage. Daniel was okay with that. What mattered was quieter. The building beneath the civic complex was rewired correctly. Additional inspections became mandatory. Documentation processes were revised. Somewhere down the line, an accident that might have happened never did. No one would ever know. And that, Daniel realized, was the nature of real accountability. It rarely looked like triumph. It looked like absence, of harm, of headlines, of funerals. One night, as Daniel tucked Noah into bed, his son asked, "Are you still scared?" Daniel thought about it. "Sometimes." Noah smiled sleepily. "That's okay. You still did it." Daniel turned off the light and stood in the doorway, listening to his son's breathing settle into a steady rhythm. He understood now that resolution did not mean closure. It meant continuation, moving forward with scars instead of illusions, with clarity instead of comfort. And while the world might never call him a hero, Daniel knew something quieter and more enduring had been preserved. The right to look his child in the eye and tell him without hesitation that truth mattered, even when it cost something. Life did not return to what it had been before. It settled into something new, less innocent, more deliberate, but steadier than Daniel had feared during the worst moments. The crisis no longer dominated each day, yet its imprint remained, shaping how he moved through the world and how he taught his son to do the same. Daniel returned fully to his night rotation by choice. The hours were harder, but the quiet suited him. Fewer meetings, fewer words, more time to work with his hands, to inspect systems that hummed softly in the dark, carrying electricity where it needed to go. He trusted machines more than narratives now. Machines either worked or they didn't. They did not pretend. At home, evenings became calmer. Noah's health stabilized enough that doctor visits spaced farther apart. His laugh returned easily, the sharpness of fear fading into something softer. Daniel noticed how quickly children adapted when given room to breathe. They rebuilt routines together, not the old ones, but new versions shaped by experience. Dinner at the same time each night, homework at the kitchen table, quiet conversations before bed where Noah talked about school and Daniel listened without checking the clock. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the window, Noah asked, "Do you ever wish you didn't say anything?" Daniel considered the question carefully. He had learned not to answer too quickly, not to offer certainty when honesty required complexity. "I wish the world made it easier to do the right thing," he said, "but I don't wish I stayed quiet." Noah nodded, absorbing this. "Me neither." The city's reforms continued in the background, slow and uneven. New policies appeared. Old habits resisted change. Daniel no longer followed the updates closely. He had learned that progress rarely moved in straight lines, and watching every step only invited frustration. What mattered to him now was closer. On weekends, Daniel took Noah to the public library, one of the buildings he had inspected countless times. They sat at long tables beneath warm lights, Noah reading while Daniel reviewed technical manuals or simply watched his son breathe easily. There was a comfort in knowing that the systems overhead had been checked, rewired, made safer. Not perfect, but better. Occasionally, someone recognized Daniel. A quiet thank you, a brief nod. Once, a young maintenance worker asked him how he knew when to speak up. Daniel answered honestly, "You don't always know. You just decide who you want to be afterward." That answer stayed with him. The months passed. Seasons shifted. The story faded from public memory, replaced by newer controversies, louder voices. Daniel was relieved. He had never wanted attention, only accountability. One night, as Daniel tucked Noah into bed, his son asked a question that surprised him. "Do you think people are good?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, thinking. "I think most people want to be," he said, "but sometimes they're scared." Noah yawned. "You were scared." "Yes," Daniel said softly. "Very. But you still did it." Daniel smiled. "I did." Noah closed his eyes, comforted by the certainty of that fact. After the light was off, Daniel stood alone in the hallway for a moment longer than usual. He felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that followed effort, not fear. He understood now that courage did not mean the absence of doubt. It meant carrying doubt without letting it decide for you. There were still consequences he lived with. His career trajectory had changed. Trust, once shaken, rebuilt slowly. Some doors would never open again. He accepted that. What he had gained could not be measured in promotions or praise. He had preserved something quieter, more durable, the ability to live without rehearsing explanations, the freedom to answer his child's questions without hesitation, the knowledge that when faced with pressure, he had chosen alignment over comfort. Late one evening, as Daniel prepared for another shift, Noah stood in the doorway holding his jacket. "Don't forget this," Noah said seriously. Daniel took it. "Thanks." As he stepped outside, Daniel looked back once more. The apartment was small, ordinary, safe. That was enough. The world beyond their door remained imperfect, full of systems that failed and people who looked away. Daniel no longer believed one person could fix all of that, but he believed one person could refuse to make it worse. And for a single father raising a child who watched everything he did, that refusal mattered more than any victory ever could. Sometimes the most powerful endings don't come with applause. They come quietly after the noise fades, when no one is watching anymore. Daniel never became famous. His name did not turn into a headline that lasted. There was no ceremony, no public apology, no moment where the system stood up and admitted it was wrong. What happened instead was smaller and far more important. A building that would not fail, a child who could sleep without struggling to breathe, a father who could look his son in the eye and know that when the moment came, he didn't choose silence over truth, because this story was never really about infrastructure or hearings or documents. It was about the quiet decisions no one sees, the ones that teach our children who we are, long before they understand what we do. Daniel didn't change the whole world, but he changed the world that mattered most to him. And maybe that's the only kind of courage that actually lasts. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were in his place, with everything to lose and someone depending on you, would you have stayed silent or would you have spoken up? Let me know your answer in the comments. I read them all. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories about ordinary people, difficult choices, and quiet courage, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story might not be about a single father. It might be about someone who looks a lot like you. See you in the next video.